Hi, everyone. Welcome to today's talk by Professor Jonathan Pober on becoming a tenure track assistant professor, a career path for physics graduate students. But this talk is open to all students, and you will find this talk very useful. I know many of you want to become a professor after you graduate, finish your postdoc. And that position is extremely competitive. But I think if you want it, you can do it because with bronze diploma in physics department, you are highly qualified, and our curriculum and our research program will prepare you very well for that kind of position. But there are still a lot of things that you need to do to prepare for that transition. And today we have a wonderful speaker from our own assistant professor, Jonathan Pober. He has been with our department since 2016 after receiving his PhD degrees from Berkeley in 2013 and also a postdoc period of a couple of years. So he is one of our best professors, teachers in the department. He has taught intro courses and also specialized courses to our undergraduate and graduate students. For that, he received the Henry Merritt Riston Fellowship from Brown University in recognition of his teaching excellence. And also, he is an experimental astrophysicist. His research focuses on the history of the universe through the observation neutral hydrogen on cosmic scales. He develops ultra-sensitive radio telescopes for this astronomical observation. So, Jonathan, the floor is yours.
Okay, well, thank you, Young, for that introduction. Let me make sure the screen share is working and get my slides up. Is that coming through for everybody?
Yes.
Okay, great. So again, thank you for the introduction. My goal here is probably to talk for 30 or so minutes. I want to make sure there's time for questions and there's lots of folks on, so hopefully we'll be able to have some discussion following this. But I want to kind of give a general sense of what I think I did successfully as a graduate student, as a postdoc, even as an undergraduate to get to where I am now. And want to begin with a lot of caveats. I think first and foremost, this is a talk about how you can strive to become an assistant professor in physics. If that's not something you want to do, that's totally fine. I think that there's lots of reasons why you would want to be an assistant professor and move on to a full professorship, but there are reasons you might not want to. Everything has upsides and downsides. But that's not really what I want to discuss today. I'm assuming you're here because you recognize there are upsides to this career track and you want to know how to pursue it as best as you can. But with a PhD in physics, an undergraduate degree in physics, there are lots and lots of things you can do. And so I don't want to pretend that those don't exist. But the other big caveat is survivorship bias, right? I'm here. I got an assistant professorship in physics and have been here for several years now, but that doesn't mean that I did the right things. So the things that I'm going to say were successful for me, I think they're the right things. I think they're good techniques, and I've tried to generalize, but I can probably point to examples of people who did similar things and ultimately didn't land this position. So, take everything with a grain of salt. Do what sounds right for you. But I said I'm doing my best to generalize and try and come away with some lessons that I think are generally applicable. Continuing, there's a long list of caveats, but a lot of this is luck. It's not all luck. but there's a lot that's out of your control. I think back on my own career. If Brown had hired the year before I applied, I wouldn't be here. I wouldn't have been a strong candidate. If Brown had hired the year after I applied, I'd be at another university having taken another job. And so there's a lot of things that are out of your control. What this is about is maximizing your chances of success to take the opportunities that do arise. And lastly, I feel I have to mention, I'm only a tenure track professor. If any of the things I talk about today turn out to have backfired and wind up being bad news for me in 18 months' time, you can check in and ask how things went when my tenure review comes up. But I think these are all good things that I'm recommending you do. So caveats aside, where I want to start is a book that my PhD advisor gave me to read about 10 years ago now. I admit I haven't read it since then, so I perhaps am not doing it justice. And I remember when I did read it, I didn't agree with everything in there. There were some things that didn't strike me as things I wanted to do. But it really got me thinking. So this book is called Marketing for Scientists. And it really pitches the idea that marketing, it's not a dirty word. It's not a trick. It's not something that you're being deceptive and trying to convince people you're something you're not. It's a skill. And it's a skill of identifying what people want and figuring out how to give it to them, and really matching what you can offer with what people actually need. And so I think that the number one lesson I took away from reading this is that you need to think of yourself as a brand. You are selling yourself when you're going on the job market, trying to get an assistant professorship. You need a sales pitch. You need to be able to tell people what it is that you do and what it is that's unique. And so when I say brand, I kind of have some questions that you can ask yourself. What is it that you do differently from everybody else? What kind of role in the physics ecosystem will you fill? How will you be different from your advisor? If a university wanted somebody who did exactly what your advisor did, then they'd go and try and hire your advisor. And so you really want to pitch yourself in a very unique way. And I use the word niche. I want to be careful not to confuse niche with over specialization. Your niche is not that you develop this one incredibly unique technique as part of your PhD, and you're the best in the world at this one very specific technique. That's probably true. When you do a PhD, you're becoming the best in the world at something. There's no doubt about that. But that's not the same as your brand. It's really kind of where you fit in your field as a whole. And so as an example, the brand that I came up with when I was on the job market is looking at my research field. I sort of saw we were in a position where my field in radio astronomy, cosmology, was pretty new. It really got started as some radio astronomers who worked on pulsars hearing about this idea from some cosmologists to do a really hard experiment and saying, I bet I could build a radio telescope that could do that. And so I pitched myself as really the first person who understood the astronomy and understood the cosmology to work on the experimental side. And that was sort of my brand, that I wasn't a pure radio astronomer who only understood the hardware. I wasn't a theorist who only understood the cosmologists. I fit in between those. And that felt like a niche that really didn't exist at the time. So that's sort of, as an example of what I mean by your brand. And again, I said this already, but don't think of this as a trick. You're not deceiving people. At the end of the day, academia is a business like everything else. I am drawing a paycheck to do this job. I'm not doing it out of the goodness of my heart. And so, I had to convince somebody that what I'm doing is worth paying for. And that's just like any other job out there. And so selling yourself, marketing yourself is not a bad thing. It's really, you know, what you want to put together before you go on the job market. And so I've tried to think of a couple things. You know, what can you do to build this brand that I speak of as an undergraduate, as a graduate student? How can you figure out where you want to fit in, where you want to position yourself? And so one aspect of this is figuring out where you belong in the broader context of your scientific field. And so some questions to ask yourself, right? What are the key questions in your research field? What's the history? What were people asking 10 years ago, 5 years ago? Right? Why are the questions that people are asking now the questions? Why haven't those been answered, and why have other ones been answered? There's also a part of kind of the broader ecosystem. What are other people working on? Your competitors, your colleagues, what do their experiments look like? And are there any big things coming up, you know, in experimental physics, as whether it's colliders or telescopes that get built once every decade or 2 decades? You know, where do you fit in kind of the time frame of that next revolution? Those are the things you want to understand. You know, my advice on how do you start building this understanding? Well, you know, you have to get familiar with the literature outside your specific research. Journal clubs are invaluable, whether you know one exists or whether you need to start one. One of the most useful things I did as an undergrad, as a graduate student, was a reading group I formed, just kind of a couple grad students, a couple postdocs. There were no faculty. We did this all on our own, and we met every week, every 2 weeks or so, and tackled one big famous paper in cosmology, you know, sometimes going back to the 1960s or 1970s, but worked on this again to build that context, build that understanding. Similarly, I think that the talks that we offer in our department, the seminars, the colloquia, you know, not every single seminar is going to be an epiphany, but if you can go to the talk and understand their context, right? What questions are is the speaker trying to answer with their research? Why are those the questions? Why is their research hard? What is the challenge? If you can understand that, take that away from every talk you go to, that's an incredibly valuable exercise. And lastly, I think, you know, topical conferences, like there's a lot. I know there's the big APS meeting, AAS meeting, things like that are huge and very interesting to get a kind of an overview of what's going on in physics and astronomy. But you know, opportunities to go to kind of specialized topical conferences on your research field and just listen. You know, I know the department provides support for students to attend conferences, present at conferences, and so making sure you go to these and again, really understanding what are people working on. And so I think the big question here for this broader context of the science you work in, how can you position yourself to be part of the next big thing? You know, when somebody hires you, you're going to be a leader in your field because you have this relationship to this experiment or this project or this new idea. That's a brand. That's the scientific side of things, but I want to be upfront about the other side of things. I think it's very important to understand the financial aspects of your field. Who funds the research? What kind of grants do people get? How much money? What does that actually fund? You know, if you get a $500,000 grant, is that 20 graduate students? You know, a month of a graduate student's time? Actually understanding how much does a dollar of research funds buy? What kind of projects can that support? And then, you know, are there funding priorities in your community? Are there things you work on that are really fundable right now? You know, machine learning, artificial intelligence has been on the upswing for the last couple of years. That's a major area of interest. Lots of dollars are going into that field. That's just an example, but you know, knowing kind of what are the big funding agencies, National Science Foundation, Department of Energy, NASA, what are they paying attention to right now? And so similar to the science side of things, how can you actually learn this information? How can you develop this context? As a graduate student, I think it's important to know how you're being paid. Right? If you're a teaching assistant, the department is supporting you. But if you're a research assistant, what grant are you on? How many different grants are you on? Just getting that picture of where your support comes from. I think as a graduate student, particularly as a postdoc, but as a senior graduate student, understanding the grant process is really important. Ask your advisor as they're working on their latest grant, what's going on. Right? A big part of the grant proposal process is the scientific justification, the 10 or 15 pages that pitches the science to a review committee. But then there's all sorts of other parts. There's preparing a budget. There's a budget justification. There's facilities statements. There's all sorts of things that are not my favorite part of the job. I'm not telling you this is joy, but this is important to understand. When it comes time to interviewing for an assistant professorship or being an assistant professor, knowing how to get funding is very important. And so I think in astronomy, the decadal survey came out a couple of weeks ago, really prioritizing all the funding for the next decade of astronomy. I know other fields do similar things. Planetary science has a decadal survey. In other fields, it's a little less clear, but knowing what the funding agencies are talking about is another very important thing. And the reports that they write, signing yourself up for NSF newsletter and hearing what the NSF is excited about this month is worth your time. And so to distill this to one big question, it's how will you pay for your independent research program? And the emphasis is on independent. That's ultimately what universities and colleges are looking for with an assistant professor, is somebody setting up their own research program that pays for itself, supports its own students, and produces high quality science, but does it on its own. And so why am I emphasizing funding so much? Why do I think that this is so important? I think this is an important context to know. So this pie chart here, or I guess maybe that's not a pie chart. I don't know what kind of chart that is. This ring chart here is Brown University's breakdown of their operating budget for next year. Where does all the dollars that Brown University spends on things go? Where is it going to come from? The biggest by far is this red chunk here that comes from tuition. Almost half of Brown's budget comes from tuition. But the second biggest is this 18% from sponsored research. That's grants that faculty bring in. And it's not just the funding in the grants. Right? My grants pay some of my salary and my student support for computing that we use. But if you're not aware, all grants at pretty much all universities come with what's called indirect costs. And that's the money that pays for things you normally don't think about. A number to keep in mind, it varies from university to university, but something like 60% is the indirect costs. And so what that means, if I need $1 million for my research, I have to ask the funding agency for $1.6 million. And that extra $600,000 are what are called indirect costs. They pay for all the essential services that the university provides to researchers, whether that's internet, printers, really basic things, staff support, critical resources. Well, it's not 50% of the university's operating budget, but the grants professors bring in are important. And so, universities will give you startup funds to get your research program going before you go out to the funding agencies and bring in your own grants. But you want to be able to show that you're going to have return on that investment. And that's what kind of this pitch that you show up when you interview for a faculty job. You want a good plan for how are you going to support your research and be valuable to the students, to the other faculty, to the university, that you've thought that through and planned that out. The science alone is only part of the picture. So that's my advice on brand building. There's a couple other things I want to get to. As I said, probably only aim to talk for 10 or 15 more minutes. But my second big piece of advice is give good presentations, give good talks. So this is a do as I say, not as I do moment, as I'm showing you a slide with nothing but text on it. But talks are opportunities to market yourself. They're the best opportunity you get. And so if you ask me what the most useful thing that I did for my career or over the entire course of my education was, it was being a member of the high school debate team. And being on the high school debate team taught me two really important things. One is that public speaking is a skill, like anything else. It's not just that some people are good public speakers and don't get nervous, and some people will always be nervous and always struggle to speak in public. It's something you can practice. And so I started off as a pretty uncomfortable, pretty mediocre debater. And after 4 years of going to debate tournament after debate tournament, really practiced this skill. And so I think finding the opportunities to practice your talks, whether it's with your research group, with other grad students, and if you're going to a conference, you're going to give a seminar, get that practice in. It's something you can get better and better and better at giving talks. The other lesson is that presentations have a logical flow to them. It's not just, here's a chart, here's a chart, here's a chart, here's a chart, that's my science. That everything implicitly is an argument. And so I went and found this. I never really thought about my talks in this way until I was preparing for this one. But this is a flow chart that high school debate and college debate uses this very rigorous format to structure all the presentations. And so, it's divided into, this is a parliamentary debate. And so the prime minister starts with 8 minutes and they make 2 or 3 arguments. And very explicitly, you have to say, this is my first argument, this is my second argument, this is my third argument. If you don't do that signposting, then the judges don't follow you. Then you have the opposition present, and they have to respond. This is my response to the first argument. This is my response to the second argument. Here are 2 new arguments. And then the government gets another turn to respond, bolster their arguments again, respond to the opposition argument. And it goes with this flow of clearly signposted arguments that must be responded to. And so as I said, I never thought of my talks in this format until I was preparing for this one. But when I look at all the seminars I give, and especially the job talks I gave, they followed this format. And so, my introduction was, here's why my science is interesting. Argument 1, argument 2, argument 3. These are the interesting things we can learn from the science that I do. My method section was kind of the opposition response to that. This is why my science is hard. This is why it takes effort. This is why it takes time. This is why it takes skill. But my results section was, going back on the affirmative again, saying, this is why my way of answering these questions is making progress. And, finally a conclusion, well, this is why we're not done. But everything followed. So one very important point here was you can't drop an argument, meaning if the opposition makes a point and you fail to respond to it, that loses you the debate. And so in your talk, if you mention something in your introduction as a key idea, don't go forgetting about it, If it's forgettable, you shouldn't have said it at all. But having this kind of flow to your talk, this kind of back and forth, this is how my field works, I think really helps explain your science, but also sell your science. And so working on your talks, I can't stress that enough. And one thing in particular, universities want evidence that you can be a good teacher, not just a researcher. And your background, the positions you've had may not have given you a lot of teaching opportunities. But if you show up and you give a clear, coherent, well thought out talk, that speaks a lot to your ability to then later teach a class, even if you don't have that clear documentation, right, that you taught a class and you got great student evaluations. So it's really important. I'm going to take a minute and tell you a story about how important a good talk can be. So this is a moment of my own experience. I hope nothing like this ever happens to you, but the picture here is of Seattle, because this took place at the American Astronomical Society meeting in Seattle in 2011, so about 11 years ago. And at this time, I had been a member of my research group for just over a year, maybe 12, 13 months. I had joined the previous fall. And I wasn't doing a whole lot as kind of still a first going on second year student on the project. But at this AAS meeting, there was a presentation, a special 90-minute session where all the leaders of my field were going to get together, pitch their experiments, summarize their experiments, and then spend a lot of time writing a white paper for the next decadal survey about how they're going to put their experiments together into something bigger. So this was a pretty big gathering, and it was an important gathering for all the experiments to be represented. My PhD advisor died of a heart attack about 5 months before this. We had no faculty on our project at the time. We had a postdoc who was really running the experiment, and he became a professor, and he ultimately served as my advisor for my PhD. But this postdoc, Aaron Parsons, he was going to show up and give this talk because we had no PI on the experiment at the time. I was going to show up and give a poster presentation on some very technical work I was doing at the time. I was researching how the heating up and cooling down of our antennas in the sun were causing 1% level gain changes in the amplifiers, and how we were going to correct for that. It was not the most exciting piece of science, but that was what I was working on, and that was my poster. And so I remember getting to my hotel room in Seattle, getting off the plane. I've literally just opened the door. My cell phone rings, and it's Aaron, this postdoc serving as my advisor, saying, "My wife has gone into early labor. Can you give the talk tomorrow?" And I say, "Are you sure?" And he says, "Yes." "Okay, can you send me your slides?" "I don't have any slides. I haven't written it yet." "Okay. Said, "I've just checked into my hotel room. I haven't opened my suitcase yet." I hang up the phone. I open my suitcase and realize I didn't bring the power cord for my laptop. And this was, back before I used Macs. I had a Toshiba with one of these super specific power cords. No one could lend me one. And so I had 3 hours to write this talk before I ran out of batteries, upload it to the AAS server, and give it the next morning at this big important presentation. As I hope nothing like this ever happens to you. But the fact that I gave this talk, and I gave a pretty good talk, really opened doors for me. People started inviting me to more conferences, to give more talks. And I think the fact that I had the context of my experiment, one thing that I immediately knew when I was starting to write this talk, I was not going to talk about 1% level amplifier changes due to the sun heating up the telescope. That was not the right thing to discuss in this context, right? I was discussing the goals of the experiment, the overarching approach of the experiment, how we fit in with all the other experiments. And the fact that I'd gone to the meetings, been an active listener, really tried to learn that was what let me give this talk. And as I said, that opened a lot of doors for me down the road. And so you never know when the opportunity will present itself. But if you're ready for it, I think you can take advantage when things come your way like that. just a couple more slides. I'll wrap up and start taking questions probably in 5 or 10 minutes, I hope. But looking ahead, beyond kind of doing these things in graduate school, learning the context, practicing your presentations, putting together your brand, a couple other pieces of advice I have. As a graduate student, you're not going to go straight to a faculty position, with very rare exceptions. You're going to go to a postdoc, and what does a postdoc do for you? Well, it's a wonderful time to do independent research. As a graduate student, you've got a lot of other things going on, whereas as a postdoc, you've hit your stride as a researcher. That's what you're there to do. But you want to land a good one. And so, one piece of advice I have is think about who's going to be writing you letters. You need 3 letters for most positions. If one of them comes from outside Brown, from an independent researcher who knows you well, that carries a lot of weight. How can you get that letter? And are there opportunities for collaboration? If you can strike up a conversation with someone at a conference, or your advisor has a colleague who is working on a project and your work is relevant, building those relationships early, I think, and getting that external letter really does help. And if you're fortunate enough to have multiple postdoc positions to choose between after you've applied, what makes a good one? Well, my questions are, which position is going to help you build that brand? Some postdocs come with a lot of time for independent research. Some postdocs are supported off a grant where you have a very specific role to a very specific project, and you need to do a very specific thing. And so how does that specific thing fit your brand? It might be perfect, but if not, what's the balance between that work and your independent work? And more broadly, how can you pick up new skills, new parts of your portfolio, things that you couldn't do as a graduate student? Will you have the opportunity to advise students, particularly graduate students? Could you write a grant? That's becoming increasingly rare that universities will let postdocs be lead on a grant, but there's still a few positions out there, and being able to say, when you're applying for faculty jobs, I have a grant. I've already cleared that first hurdle. That's huge. And so if that position exists for you, that can be great. Teaching, it's a huge part of the job, but when it comes to applying for faculty positions, the research comes first and foremost. That's true at a research university. That's true at a teaching college. I went to a teaching college as an undergraduate. I looked at a lot of teaching colleges when I was on the job market. The research is just as important there. And so building a teaching portfolio is very important, but if it detracts from your research, if you spend too much time not being able to build that research brand, that can be a downside, even though it sounds like great experience for being a professor. So that's important to consider as well. And then when it comes time to apply to faculty jobs, a couple pieces of advice. Read the job advertisements very carefully. And more often than not, the advertisement tells you if you're a fit. Advertisements will often say something, we're particularly interested in people in this subdiscipline, but it's an open search, we'll accept applications from any field. When they say they're particularly interested in that subdiscipline, if you're in that subdiscipline, you should apply. If you're not, give it some thought, right? It's not a sure thing that they're not interested in you, but they're probably looking for someone in that subdiscipline. And then when you write a cover letter, that's where you hit what they say in the job application. Right? You were looking for someone who could do this, work with this new center. I can do that. Make sure you say that very clearly. One piece of personal advice, I was on the job market for 2 years. It was very fortunate. It was very short. My first year on the job market was very stressful. My second year wasn't. And that's because I made the decision to stop worrying about whether a school was in the right spot or a good fit when deciding to apply to it. The first year I was on the job market, I would before deciding to apply to any school, say, okay, well, this school's kind of remote. My partner is in industry. They're going to need to be near a city. Can we find a place in between that has a commute? And then I wouldn't get an interview at that school anyway. So it was a lot of stress for nothing. And so if it looks like it could be a good job, apply. And if you get invited, then you can start doing the exercise of, could this be a place that works for me? And the school makes a decision for you, doesn't invite you for an interview. Easier said than done, but I just try not to take it personally. There's a lot of things out of your control that, they are looking for someone in a particular field at a particular time. Just because it's not you this year doesn't mean you're not doing great science. It just, the circumstances didn't line up. If you do get an interview, and this may be far away for many of you, so I don't know if you remember this, but do some research on the university. What do they teach in the department? What's the breakdown between undergrads, grad students, postdocs? What would research for one of those students look like for you? Does the school have a particularly unique aspect or mission statement, right? Is it a Jesuit university or a liberal arts college founded on Quaker values? There's all sorts of different schools out there. Doing a little bit of homework and figuring that out ahead of time, it goes a long way. And then, as I said, give a really good job talk. It's not just a research seminar. Even if you've given a lot of research seminars, make sure you adapt it. Turn it into that sales pitch that sells you and your vision for where your field is going to go. And I think that's what makes a really good impression when you're actually there and doing that interview. One last thing, and then I'll conclude and take questions. Treat your peers, your coworkers, your colleagues with respect. And so be someone other people want to work with, especially if you're coming from a position of privilege or are currently in a position of power. Treating people with respect is just really important. Like I began, there's a lot of caveats here. This isn't saying, let yourself be walked over. I know there are some fields where it's very competitive, be scooped, scoop or be scooped. Do what you need to do to succeed. I'm also very aware that what constitutes quote unquote nice behavior carries a lot of gender bias. There's been studies that letters of recommendation for women contain words like team player, great colleague. Letters of recommendation for men contain things like leader, whereas women might be described as bossy. So it's really problematic. And so when I say be nice, I don't mean let yourself be walked over, but it's still really important. And the last caveat here, similarity attraction bias. This is the idea that if given free rein, hiring committees will hire people who look like them. And so it is really problematic when a job search committee says, well, I want to pick someone who's going to be my colleague for the next 30 years and we'll get along really well. So that's one step away from perpetuating the problems with diversity and inclusion that we have in the field, because you wind up picking someone who looks just like you. But those caveats aside, I still thought I had to include this, that treating people with respect and being a kind person, probably the most important thing I can say. That this field, it's competitive, but it's not an excuse to be a bad person. So my conclusions, to begin, go back to the point I said at the beginning, a professorship is one of many things you can do with a PhD in physics. This talk was about becoming a professor. It doesn't mean it's the only thing you should do. It doesn't mean you're a disappointment if you don't do it. it just was what this talk was about. And there's lots of other things to consider doing with a degree in physics. The main thrust was this idea that academia is still a business. Doing good science is necessary. Beneath everything I said is be a good scientist, do your research, do it well, do interesting things. But that doesn't speak for itself. And so you need to speak for your science and speak for yourself and sell that brand. And as I said in the last slide, it's easy to be competitive with people and be short with people when things are this stressful. The job market is stressful. I'm not going to claim it isn't. But treat people with kindness and respect. And I think everyone will be better off for it. So with that, I'm very happy to open the floor for questions. I think we've got enough people on the call that maybe raising your hand in the chat or in the participants is probably the best way. But if anybody else, Gong or
Yes.
any of the other organizers have suggestions for how to do Q&A, I'm very open to it.
Okay, Jonathan, thank you so much. Wonderful talk. So now it's open for questions, and you can raise your hand or you can type your question in the chat, and I will read the chat to Professor Jonathan.
I think the chat's disabled.
Oh. Questions? I'm sure you have questions, right?
Let's see. So I don't see a way to enable chat.
Oh, chat is disabled?
I think someone said that, but I.
Okay. Pete or Kathy, are there ways to enable chat?
Well, I just typed on chat, and it seems to be, I mean, it's coming up for me.
I think I just enabled it.
Oh, you enabled, okay.
Yeah, it's back now. Thank you.
Yeah, the other thing I want to add is that Jonathan it really exemplified our faculty in the department. And we have 29 faculty members, and all of us really care about you. And feel free to ask advice from your advisor or from the rest of the faculty in terms of how to apply for a faculty position.
And if anybody does want to reach out offline, I'm very happy to respond there as well. So.
Although it would be helpful for if people do have questions to ask them now, because if you have a question, I can guarantee you there are more people who have the same question.
So yeah, one question, thanks Silverio, for how do things change for a pure teaching position? Well, there's a whole spectrum of universities. I think where I went to graduate school, how I like to describe it was teaching was an eccentric hobby that was tolerated if you brought in enough research dollars. And where I went to undergraduate was a small liberal arts college where professors were teaching multiple courses a semester. There were no grad students, no postdocs, and a whole range of places on the spectrum in between there. I think a pure teaching position, there are increasingly universities that are hiring what they call either tenure track or tenure stream teaching professorships, where your job is to teach. Those are still, I'd say, rarer than positions at teaching focused colleges, and tenure track research professorships. But I think, with my limited experience, having looked at a lot of teaching colleges, if research is a component, having a research portfolio, as I described, is still the most important factor. Even if they just say this is a teaching college, we teach. A question on a lot of people's minds is, well, if our best undergraduate shows up, the best person we've had in decades, are they going to get the experience that's going to send them to the best graduate school? Are they going to do research with a professor who's still doing top tier research? Will maybe get them a paper, get them a high profile result, and give them that component of their graduate school application. I think I have less that I can personally say about one of these tenure stream teaching positions. I think building teaching experience, finding creative ways to do it is pretty important. Right? As a graduate student, you can't usually just teach a course. That's not the way universities are structured. But if you can find something that's a step beyond a standard teaching assistantship position, that can help build your portfolio as well. So some things I did as a graduate student were, to either be a head TA, where I had a little bit less of a role, kind of running workshops, and more of a role running the class, or running kind of student-oriented seminars that we advertised as kind of informal classes for students to take. But I think that would be my advice, is that if research is a component of the job, then getting that research program developed is still really important.
Jonathan, let me read a question for you in the chat area. What are the advantages of pursuing academics instead of going for a job in industry? How does this affect your research?
I mean, it's a great question. Obviously, I have limited perspective. I stayed in academia. I didn't go into industry. I think a lot of the skills that make you a successful academic translate to an industry environment. I think as far as what are the advantages of the various positions, an academic position, if you can get the funding for it, you have a lot of freedom to choose what research projects you work on. If serving in that advisor role for students, if that's something you enjoy, working with students, helping them learn the research skill set that you work on, that's pretty unique to an academic position. Industry positions, there's no question that they will pay you a lot more. The job market for people with technical skills is also very hot right now, and salaries are very high. But there are research scientist positions out there. Several of my former PhD students now have research scientist positions where they work for a corporation, but mostly are doing research. It's not astrophysics, but it's not that different either. And so there's a whole spectrum of positions out there.
Okay, Jonathan, there's another question. Let me read it. Would you say it is less important to improve talking skills if I don't care about money and just want to focus on research?
I mean, I think what I would say is, if you want to be a professor, just caring about research means understanding the financial aspects, how you are going to support that research program with funding. And so different professors have different approaches. I've put together, say, a relatively large group of PhD students that demands a lot of funding to support all of those students. Certainly, you don't have to do that. There are very successful faculty members who work with, 1 or 2 students as opposed to 4 or 5, and that requires less funding. But I think there are a few positions out there where you're truly given an unlimited reign to do research without having to support it.
Thank you. So the next set of questions are, what are some things in the book Marketing for Scientists that you would advise us to ignore if we read the book? Is there anything a female grad student, postdoc can do to get around being called bossy and manage to be called a leader instead? Does being very nice usually work to a female scientist's benefit or detriment?
So two really good questions. For the first one, again, my caveat was I read that book over a decade ago. So I remember it made me think, and that's why I wanted to mention it. Are there specific things that I remember being less good? I'm not sure. So, you know, I'd say it wasn't too long. It wasn't too dense. You know, you could probably read through the whole thing in a day. And just if something doesn't sound right to you, then it's probably not something you want to do. For the second question, you know, I think the people writing the letters of recommendation need to take a lot of ownership for answering that. We need to be aware of gender bias in our language when we recommend people. Obviously, you don't have control over, you know, who's writing your letters and you know, what kind of language they're using. But, you know, I think working with people that support you, you know, finding research advisors that you think, you know, understand your career goals, understand how to support you, and will write you those letters of recommendation is probably one of the most important things you do. But I wish I had a great answer to say if we just did this, gender bias would disappear. But
so Jonathan, hopefully in the future we will find a female scientist to talk about leadership, and so that's something on my sort of schedule in the future. Next question, could you also tell us a little about the postdoc application experience for you? What was the postdoc, a PhD to postdoc transition like? When does one start looking for a postdoc? Typically, how long does it take? Thank you.
yeah, so personally, I did something that I cannot recommend for as far as postdoc searches, which was in the 5th year of my PhD. I said, I'm going to only apply to the most prestigious postdocs. If I get one, I'll graduate and take it. And if I don't, you know, my advisors got funding for another year, standard time to graduation, 6 years. It worked out for me. I got a great postdoc fellowship after only applying for a couple postdocs. But I can't recommend that because as soon as you go and you spend that time crafting a postdoc statement, working on your application, you know, really putting in the effort, what sounded like a reasonable outcome of, well, I'll just spend another year in grad school if I don't get anything, you know, feels a lot more like disappointment than you thought it would. And so, you know, I think the other piece of advice I got is you'll know when you're ready to start thinking about postdocs the first time your advisor says something and you immediately go, that is wrong, and here is why. You know, you're becoming an expert on the material you're doing your research on. You're the world's foremost, and you know what it's about. And again, once that first moment clicks, you know, you can really start thinking about what would kind of a next stage of my research look like, but as a more independent researcher. But you know, if you can spend a couple years on the postdoc job market and have that fallback of graduate school and not be, you know, too hung up on how it plays out, it can be a good fallback. But you know, it's more common, I think, to do 2 postdocs and kind of have a first postdoc that then transitions into a second, more prestigious, more independent postdoc. And so, you know, it can, there's personal benefits too, right? For one person, the idea of moving around the world every 2 years to a new place is fun and exciting, and to person that can be terribly overwhelming and not appealing at all. And so you've got to decide kind of what you're looking for at that stage. But I personally got very lucky in the postdoc search. So
Jonathan, next questions are from an international student. What are some of the funding grant challenges for international students?
yeah, no, it is more challenging. There's a lot of fellowships out there for graduate students that from places like the National Science Foundation that are restricted to U.S. citizens. There are, I went to UC Berkeley for graduate school, and I know it was super critical for us to become California residents by the end of our first year so we could get in-state tuition, and international students couldn't do that until they were past their fourth year and had defended their prelim. And so it became very stressful for international students that they were being held to a different standard than everyone else. It's not fair in a lot of ways. I think most students are supported as research assistants. And so that's dollars from a professor's grant. And usually those do not have restrictions on them as far as citizenship. But talking up front with a research advisor saying, I'm not going to be able to apply for the NSF fellowship. Will you have support for me as a research assistantship? I think is an important conversation to have. As I said, know how you're getting funded, but there's unfortunately, you're right. There are more challenges, and it is harder.
Jonathan, the next question. There are very few professors of color in physics. How would you circumvent, like me, personal bias in the job selection process?
Yeah, I think more universities are becoming aware of this and giving their search committees training in implicit bias and good hiring practice. A lot of the best practices for hiring are things that are hard to implement in academia. One of group hiring, if you can hire 4 or 5 people at once instead of one at a time, is shown to increase diversity. There's almost never funding to hire 4 professors at once. I think I have not been on a faculty search committee at Brown, so I don't know exactly kind of what instructions the committees are given, but I think it is becoming well understood at that level what the best hiring practices are for diversity. I think the fact that the applicant pool has already suffered so much due to bias, all along the pipeline, at the point of where people are applying to faculty positions, the diversity is already very low, is still a very big obstacle. But
Jonathan, in the search committee nowadays, it requires a statement of diversity and inclusion, in addition to a statement of research and also your resume and recommendation letters. So the diversity and inclusion statement is where you can shine, for example, by describing your contribution in improving diversity and inclusion in the field of physics. Jonathan, the next question is, how many job talks did you give and how many offers did you get?
That's a good question. So I gave, the year I was hired here, 2 job talks and had 2 faculty offers. I had, leading up to that, a lot of Skype interviews that didn't go anywhere for reasons I still can't quite self-assess. If I get through the Skype interview process, I do very well, but the Skype interviews were never my thing. But, I think having seen searches go by, been watching kind of my peers and my colleagues, I've tried to give advice that was a little bit more general than my specific situation. But for small data points, when I got to give a job talk, the advice I had seemed to work out.
Jonathan, I think our time is up. We have one last question for you. And I want to add something to the previous question. Is funding important when applying for professorship? If I have many good papers but no funding, is it enough to get a faculty position? Good question.
No, that's a great question. I mean, I think there are very limited opportunities for a postdoc or a graduate student to bring in a grant. As I said, most universities don't even let postdocs be lead on grants because they don't want them taking the grant money with them when they go to another university. I think what's important is understanding, how would you pursue funding? Do you have a good plan to get funding once you're a professor? Right? If you have evidence that you've pursued independent funding and it's been successful, great, but that's certainly not a requirement. I'd say the requirement is that you have a plan, and it's well thought through and done in consultation with other faculty, your advisors, and that it makes sense given where your field is. But yeah, no, let me just say thank you to everybody for coming and for the questions, and great to see so many people.
Jonathan, thank you so much. Professor Pober is very busy. He's teaching a very large course and also a very heavy research program he's working on. So I really like to thank you. You don't have to do this, but you did it, and you spent a lot of time preparing for this talk. Thank you so much. And I just want to let all the students to know that we have 28 of them, like Jonathan, available in our department who can help you for your career preparation. And in the future, the department is going to organize more presentations on how to get private sector jobs, how to get public sector jobs, and how to become an entrepreneur, and how to become a leader in physics. So again, thank you so much for attending this talk. Have a good day.